Hello everyone. So I just would like to state that I'm back from vacation. Sorry for not giving you the heads up earlier on, but I am back and I'm going to be uploading more frequently, as there are definitely some weirdos and issues I would like to analyze. But first, we have to come to a conclusion with Vicky's little tirades and correct some mistakes. Now, because we did part 1 last time, we will get into part 2 and talk about the other events of the Cold War. We are now going back to Germany. I'm sorry, I just couldn't help it. I just love that song. Okay, to the video.
So, the East had many highly educated people who were educated by the state and expected to help improve the country in exchange. So it kind of sucked for the East German government to see the West Germans handing out free money to everyone with high education who would move from East Germany to West Germany. The West German government also made sure to spread lots of propaganda about how anyone could become rich under capitalism.
Well, if you ask me, that's better than what the GDR had. In West Germany, you at least had a chance of getting rich. In East Germany, you had no chance of getting rich whatsoever. Only the government officials were rich. People like you and me would be poor for the rest of our lives.
So young people who were educated for free by the East German state and who were expected to return this value to the state while working there decided to leave to a capitalist country in hopes of making themselves rich off their stolen East German education. This was seen as a betrayal by the East German state, and some went as far as to denounce those who left for West Germany as traitors to their nation.
This is literally the worst attempt at trying to make the Berlin Wall look good. This is basically telling people that they're basically property who must do whatever the state tells them to do. Lovely.
Your body belongs to the state. Since your birth, the state nourished it. Now the state asks something in return.
And there were more problems originating in West Berlin. The Cold War was a really good time for spies. The West was spying on the East and the East was spying on the West. Remember the nuclear bombs from the US? They were brought to the USSR by spies. And there were many spies moving from East to West and the other way around. And the key path they used was Berlin. The reason for that is that there was no border there. You could just walk down the street and you'd be out of the country you're spying on and inside the country you're spying for. And at one point the Politburo decided to handle these problems originating in Berlin accordingly. In order to stop the traitors and spies, the decision was made to impose the border in Berlin the same way the outside borders of the country were imposed. This meant border guards, checkpoints, barbed wire, and no crossing without reason.
Excellent, he used the same argument as Bad Mouse production. The Berlin Wall was built to keep Westerners out. I'll just replay my response from this video.
More context surrounding the situation than simply the standard West good, Ost schlecht narrative behind the wall, that had just as much to do with war, espionage, and sabotage as it did to do with brain drain. I think given the circumstances we understand why it is that the latter occurred.
Oh, for God's sake. This was the Cold War. There was espionage on both sides. The Cold War is literally defined as a time of espionage, and I really didn't expect you to comment on the lovely attacks by East Germans, such as the murder of Major Arthur D. Nicholson, which should have been an act of war in 1985. He talks as if the Berlin Wall was made to keep Westerners out. If you actually look at the wall, you can see for yourself that most border posts and spotlights and the barbed wire were pointed at the east side of Berlin.
The capitalist countries were quick to complain about the Berlin Wall as it became known. They said the East German government had torn Berlin apart. A brave statement considering it was the Western powers that continued to occupy half of the capital city of another country.
Didn't the Warsaw Pact do the same thing in East Berlin?
East Germans were allowed to visit West Germany provided they had a reason, and a marriage, a funeral, or even just visiting a sick relative were enough. And West Germans could visit East Germany just as well. Saying that the wall separated families is technically true, but by that logic you'd have to agree that all borders do so, and that thus all borders should be considered as bad as the Berlin Wall, which is a road you could go down, but it isn't usually thought to its conclusion like that.
Not so fast. Not everyone could travel to the West. People who did travel to the West were usually older people who had the most family on the opposite end. Approval for travel to the West was never guaranteed, especially not for the younger population.
Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, The Berlin Wall was built and enforced as a regular border. This stayed up for a bit and will return to Germany once something happens there. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Stalin died and Khrushchev was telling everyone that he was bad. This started a tradition of Soviet leaders being shit-talked once they died, something that did not help the Soviet Union with stability. In order to counter NATO, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance with the express goal of countering NATO, not threatening the USA, just creating a counterweight to capitalist aggression. Also, the nations have now figured out how to make even more deadly bombs and how to use rockets to deliver them without them being intercepted. These rockets could also be used differently. In 1957, some Soviet scientists got very excited to use those missiles to learn stuff about space. And after a bit of development, they managed to put the first ever artificial satellite in space, Sputnik. It was just a silver ball going beep beep in space, but it was a tremendous achievement for humanity. I say for humanity, and in the socialist nations it was definitely seen as such, but in the capitalist nations the public reacted differently. They were scared of Sputnik, because now suddenly they saw that the socialist nations were technologically superior. This was known as the Sputnik crisis. The USA then decided to do the same and put an artificial satellite in orbit. The first rocket promptly blew up on the launch pad in front of the media of the whole world. Then the Soviet Union sent a dog to space. Her name was Laika, and she was the first living animal ever to reach space.
Now, he gets a lot of stuff wrong here. First of all, the desire for space exploration didn't start in the 1950s. People have been trying to explore space for a long time, well before the Cold War. For example, the first liquid fuel rocket was made in 1926 by Robert H. Goddard, and the first rocket that could successfully reach the outer rims of the atmosphere was the V-2 rocket that was made in Germany in 1944. Second of all, Sputnik was partially built by the military and was intended to counter the US's U-2 spy plane. Third of all, he is completely wrong. Laika was not the first living being in space. The first living beings in space were fruit flies that were launched on an American V-2 rocket in 1947, 10 years before Laika. Laika herself wasn't even the second being in space, as that title goes to Albert the Monkey in 1949, and even better, the US launched mice into space in 1950. Come on, you really need to do some more research.
Long story short, after enlisting literal genocidal Nazis in their spaceflight program, they managed it.
Are we really going to ignore the Nazis that were employed by the Soviet Union?
Then they stuck their flag into the moon, presumably in an attempt to make it theirs.
If they declare the moon to be US soil, then why do they put forth the Outer Space Treaty, which was said that no nation can own space? The space race was won by the US because it showed that it had the capability of landing on the moon. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, never accomplished this. They cancelled all crewed missions to the moon, unless you believe in the phantom cosmonauts conspiracy theory.
Cuba belonged to the US for a long time, and then these handsome men came along and made it not so.
When exactly did Cuba belong to the US? The only US soil on Cuba is Guantanamo Bay. The rest of Cuba actually didn't like the US. They didn't even want the US aid during the Spanish-American War.
The US president did not want to allow the USSR to do the same as they had done, so he forbid Cuba to place Soviet missiles there. Then they enforced the blockade on Cuba, which they enforced by throwing depth charges at Soviet submarines, which were armed with nuclear weapons. Please note that this is an act of war, both the blockade and the throwing depth charges at the nuclear submarine.
Now he is just straight up lying. This isn't the Cold War from the Soviet Union side anymore. He is literally just leaving out stuff and saying some incorrect statements. The depth charges dropped on the B-59 during the Cuban Missile Crisis were not nuclear-armed depth charges. Like, what is he blabbering about? The depth charges used were for training purposes, and they had little explosives in them. They would have done very little, if any, damage to the submarine itself. It was the only way to communicate with it, since it would not respond to their hails. Also, the blockade of Cuba was a quarantine in international waters, which was legal under the Rio Treaty that was signed in 1947, and Cuba itself did not withdraw until 2012. Things could have gotten a lot worse. Initially, people wanted to invade Cuba, but they decided against it. Now, for the last few parts, we really have seen that he's not giving a real assessment of the Cold War here. I wonder where he got his education on it. Anyway, I don't want this video to be very long, so we'll continue next time where we will talk about some proxy wars.
Bomba.